The winter of 1868 came early to the Bitterroot Valley. By the middle of October, the passes were already closing, the high trails disappearing under the first heavy snow, the sky pressing down low and gray over the mountains like a lid being sealed on something. The old trappers who had worked these ranges for 30 years said they had not seen an early winter like this since 1843, and they said it with the particular satisfaction of men who have survived enough hard things to feel a proprietary pride in the hardness of what is coming. The settlers who had arrived that summer said nothing. They were still learning the vocabulary of this country, still translating the landscape into something they could understand, and they did not yet have the experience to know what an early winter here actually meant. Ruth Calloway knew. She had been here since April, which was 6 months longer than most of the summer arrivals, and she had spent those 6 months paying the kind of close attention to this valley that a person pays when their survival depends on it, which hers did. She was 36 years old. She'd come west from Missouri in the spring with her husband George and their wagon, and the specific intention of building something permanent on the 160 acres they had filed on under the Homestead Act the previous year. They had chosen this valley because of the river, which ran clear and cold along the western edge of their claim, and because of the timber, which was abundant and straight and would build good walls, and because of the grass, which George said was the best grazing grass he had ever seen, and he was a man who knew grass. George had been right about all of it. George had also been dead since July. He had died of a fever that came on fast and burned through him in 11 days with a ferocity that made no sense given how strong he had been, how careful, how entirely unsuited to dying he had seemed. Ruth had done everything she knew how to do, which was considerable, because she was a capable woman with a practical knowledge of medicine and a refusal to panic in emergencies. She had kept his fever down with cold river water and willow bark tea. She had kept him still when the fever made him want to move. She had sat beside him through the nights and talked to him in a low, steady voice about the house they were going to build and the cattle they were going to run, and the first winter they were going to survive, and what spring would look like in this valley when the snow came off the mountains. He had died on a Thursday morning in July while she was getting water from the river. She had buried him on the rise above the river bend, where he had said the view was the best on the whole claim, and she had stood at the grave for a long time without speaking because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. Then she had gone back to work. Because the house was not built, because winter was coming, because George had made her promise in the last coherent conversation they had before the fever took his clarity that she would not go back, that she would stay, that she would build what they had come here to build. She had promised. She intended to keep it. The claim was 160 acres of the best land Ruth had ever seen in her life, which was saying something because she had seen a great deal of land in her 36 years. The river ran along the western boundary, clear and fast over smooth stones, full of trout she had been eating all summer. The timber on the northern slope was dense and straight, mostly lodgepole pine with some Douglas fir mixed in, the kind of timber that builds solid walls and lasts a generation. The south-facing lower acres were open grassland that would winter cattle well if she ever got to the point of running cattle, which required first building the thing that cattle lived in, which required first building the thing that she lived in, which was the immediate and pressing problem. She had a camp. It was not a house. George had built them a solid camp in the first weeks after their arrival, a lean-to against a south-facing rock outcropping that shed rain and blocked the north wind and was perfectly adequate for a Montana summer. For a Montana winter, it was not adequate at all, Ruth had understood this since approximately the first week of August and had been working on the problem ever since. The problem was that building a log cabin alone was genuinely difficult, not impossible. Ruth had grown up watching her father build, and she had absorbed more than she had realized at the time, the way children absorb things without knowing they are learning. She understood the principles. She knew what a foundation needed to be, how high a first course of logs needed to sit off the ground to avoid rot, how to notch a corner so the logs locked and didn't shift. She knew these things in the theoretical way. The practical problem was that logs were heavy. A single lodgepole pine trimmed and ready to lay weighed more than she did. Rolling it into position was possible, with the right tools and the right leverage. Lifting it was not possible. Not alone. Not for a woman of her size. She spent the first 2 weeks after George died sitting with this problem in the evenings, after the day's work was done, turning it over in her mind the way she had always approached difficult things, which was to look at them from every angle, until she found the one angle that opened into a solution. She found it on a Tuesday evening in early August, sitting by the campfire with a piece of charcoal and a flat stone that she used as a writing surface. She could not lift the logs, but she did not need to lift them. She needed to raise them. These were different things. A timber frame structure, she realized, did not require lifting logs onto a wall. It required standing timbers upright and connecting them with horizontal members that could be put in place at ground level and then raised. She had seen this method used for barns in Missouri. She had never seen it used for a house, but she could not see why it wouldn't work. She spent 3 evenings sketching and calculating on her flat stone, working out the dimensions, the number of uprights she would need, the length of the connecting beams, the method of raising a wall frame that she could manage alone. By the end of the 3rd evening, she had a plan that she believed would work. She began cutting timber the next morning. The axe was a good one. George had bought it in St. Louis, a Collins pattern axe with a 36-inch handle and a head that held its edge well. Ruth had been using it all summer for camp work, and she was comfortable with it, which was fortunate because over the next 3 months it became the primary tool of almost everything she did. She felled her first timber on a Wednesday morning in early August, and by Thursday evening she had 4 trim poles lying in a row beside the building site. And her arms ached in a way that she recognized as the specific ache of muscles being asked to do more than they had done before, which was not a pleasant sensation but was a productive one. She worked from first light to last light every day. She did not allow herself to think about George during working hours. She had found in the weeks since his death that grief was a thing that could be scheduled. It could be given its time, in the evenings, by the fire, before sleep. During the day it needed to be set aside, because it took up space that was needed for other things, for calculation and focus, and the specific physical attention that swinging an axe required. In the evenings, she let herself think about him. She kept his watch in her breast pocket. It had belonged to his father. It was a plain silver thing, not particularly valuable, that kept reasonable time, and had his initials on the back in letters she ran her thumb over sometimes without thinking about it. She thought about the house they had planned. The 2 rooms, the loft, the stone chimney that George had drawn out on paper back in Missouri, very carefully with the flue angle calculated to draw properly in a north wind. She thought about building it the way he had drawn it. She was going to build it exactly that way. That was the promise. September arrived, and with it the first cold nights, the temperature dropping into the 20s after dark, the stars sharp and brilliant in the way they were, only when the air was fully dry and clear. Ruth added a second blanket to her bedroll and noted that the camp was becoming uncomfortable and that she needed to work faster. She had the 4 main corner posts set by the first week of September. Setting them had been the hardest work she had done in her life. Each post was a 12-foot lodgepole pine trimmed to a consistent diameter, and she had dug the holes herself with a post-hole digger and then used a system of rope and leverage that had taken her most of a day to work out to raise each post vertical and hold it there while she tamped the earth around the base. The first post had taken her 4 hours to raise and set. By the 4th post, she had the method working, and she did it in under 2 hours. She stood back and looked at the 4 posts standing in their corners and felt something she had not felt since July, which was not exactly happiness, but was in the vicinity of satisfaction, which was close enough. She wrote in her journal that evening, which she had kept faithfully since leaving Missouri. 4 posts, standing, corner to corner 16 feet by 20. George's dimensions. The view from the south post is exactly what he said it would be. He was right about this land. He was right about everything. I intend to be right about the rest of it. October came cold and early. Ruth had the wall frames up by the middle of the month, the horizontal connecting beams pegged into the uprights at the heights she had calculated, the structure standing open to the sky but solid in its frame, the corner joints tight, nothing shifting when she tested it. She had developed, over the weeks of this work, a relationship with the timber that she would not have been able to describe to anyone who had not done similar work. An understanding of how wood moved and where it was likely to fail and how to persuade, rather than force it into the position it needed to be in. George would have said she had become a carpenter. She thought he would have meant it as a compliment. She was not finished. She was nowhere near finished. She still needed to fill the walls, roof the structure, build the chimney, install the door and the single window she was planning for the south wall. She estimated in her most optimistic calculations that she had 3 more weeks of work before the structure would be livable in a basic sense. The weather gave her 2. The first serious snow came on October 19th. Not a dusting, not a warning shot. A full storm that came down from the north on a Tuesday morning and dropped 14 inches by nightfall and showed no sign of stopping. Ruth worked through it. She did not have the option of not working through it. The walls needed to be filled, and the roof needed to be on, and those things needed to happen before the snow got deep enough to make the work impossible, which it would eventually if she let it. She worked in the snow with her coat and her hat, and her wool gloves that were wet through by mid-morning and stayed wet for the rest of the day. She filled the wall frames with split timber and chinking made from river clay mixed with dried grass, working from the inside out to keep the worst of the weather off the fresh chinking. She moved constantly, which kept her warm enough, and she stopped every hour to go to the fire she kept burning near the building site and stand beside it for 5 minutes with her gloves off until her hands came back. She did not let herself think about how cold it was. She thought about the chimney, about the south window, about the door she was going to hang from the iron hinges she had bought in the supply town 40 miles south in August when there had still been a road. There was not a road now. She was on her own until spring. She had known this since September. She had planned for it. Her supply situation was not comfortable, but it was not desperate. Enough flour and dried beans and salt pork to see her through to April if she was careful, plus whatever she could continue to take from the river through the ice, which in her experience was considerable if you knew what you were doing. And she had learned over the summer that she knew what she was doing. She was going to be all right. She told herself this with the specific deliberateness of someone who is not entirely sure it is true, but understands that believing it is a prerequisite for making it so. The walls were filled and chinking, applied by October 23rd. She lost 2 days to a secondary storm that made outdoor work impossible and used the time to inventory her supplies and repair her tools and lie in her bedroll in the lean-to, reading the single book she had brought with her, which was a practical guide to frontier medicine that she had already read 4 times, but continued to find useful. The roof was the hardest part. She had planned a simple pitched roof, ridgepole running east to west, rafters dropping to the wall tops on both sides. In theory, this was not complicated. In practice, working alone at a height of 14 feet in the snow, in the cold with wet gloves, it was the closest thing to impossible that she had encountered. She solved it the same way she solved everything, which was to break it into the smallest possible components and do each component separately and completely before moving to the next. She got the ridgepole up on November 1st, using a system of rope tackles she had rigged from the 4 corner posts, hauling the pole up hand over hand until it was seated in the notches she had cut at the top of the 2 end wall uprights. It took her most of a day. When it settled into position, she stood on the wall frame with the wind cutting across the valley from the north and looked out over the snow-covered grassland and the frozen river and the mountains going up into the low gray cloud, and she felt the particular vertiginous clarity that comes from being very high up and very tired and very cold, and also, somehow, not giving up. She came down and made supper. She put the rafters up over the next 4 days, working steadily, one at a time, each one lifted and positioned and pegged with a patience she hadn't known she possessed until this autumn had required it of her. The roof boards went on over 3 more days. She sealed the roof with a layer of pine pitch she had been collecting and rendering all summer for exactly this purpose, painting it on hot with a rag tied to a stick, the smell of it sharp and resinous in the cold air. She hung the door on November 11th. She stood inside the house, which was dark except for the light coming through the gap where the chimney would be, and she looked at the 4 walls and the roof and the door in its frame and the frost on the inside of the south wall, where the window opening waited for the oiled cloth she was going to stretch over it. It was a house. It was small and rough, and by no means finished, but it was a house, and it was standing, and she had built it. She sat down on the dirt floor, because there was nowhere else to sit and she did not move for a long time. She was not sure what she was feeling exactly. It was not triumph. Triumph seemed too simple for what this was. It was more the feeling of a debt paid, of a promise honored, of something that had been owed being rendered in full. She reached into her breast pocket and took out George's watch. She held it in her palm. She ran her thumb over the initials on the back. She said, to the empty room, to the rough log walls and the pitched roof and the door and its iron hinges, "I told you I would." She put the watch back. She got up. She built the chimney over the next 2 weeks, laying the stones she had been collecting from the river all summer, mortaring them with a lime and clay mix she had prepared in advance. It was slow work, but not beyond her, and by November 25th, she had a functioning fireplace and chimney that drew cleanly in the north wind, exactly as George had calculated. She lit the first fire on the evening of November 25th. She sat in front of it on the single stump she was using as a chair until the room was warm enough that she could take her coat off. Then she took her coat off. She stretched her hands toward the fire. Outside, the snow was coming down again, the 3rd significant storm since October, and the wind was moving in the pines on the northern slope with a sound she had come to know over the past months. Its different voices for different intensities of cold, the way it spoke in the spruce trees versus the way it spoke in the open grassland. She knew this place now. It was hers. Not legally, not yet. The patent would not come through until she had proven up the claim over 5 years. But it was hers in the way that matters more than law. in the way of a place you have earned through the specific currency of hard work and attention, and choosing every morning to stay. She was going to stay. She wrote in her journal that night by firelight, the first time she had been able to write by something other than a candle in months. House is standing. First, fire burning. George was right about the chimney draw. He was right about everything. I am going to spend the winter reading and planning the spring planting and the stock program, and what I need to order from the supply town when the road opens. I'm going to be here when the snow comes off the mountains. I'm going to be here for a long time. I kept my promise, George. I expect you knew I would. She closed the journal. She looked at the fire. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with its low, steady voice, and the snow came down on the valley and the river and the 160 acres of the best land she had ever seen. And inside the house that she had built with an axe and a promise, Ruth Calloway was warm. She stayed. The patent came through in 1873. Ruth Calloway is listed in the Ravalli County Land Records as the sole patent holder, one of the earliest women in the territory to hold a homestead claim in her own name. She ran cattle on the property from 1871. She hired two hands by 1875. By 1880, she had the largest operating cattle ranch in the Southern Valley. She never left. Neighbors who knew her in later years said she kept George's axe above the fireplace on two wooden pegs, blade outward. When people asked about it, she said simply that it was a good axe and she saw no reason to put it away. Some promises you keep for the rest of your life. Subscribe. A new story arrives every week. Next, One Man, Norwegian Fjord, 1942. A boat, a secret, a crossing that should have been impossible.